Hi everyone, welcome to today's Algebra 1 installment of Chapter 9.3, Solving Quadratic Equations Using Square Roots. So as I previously mentioned, there are 5 methods of how to solve a quadratic equation. So this is our third one. We've done the zero product property, which is solving by factoring, and we've done graphing. This one is by far the easiest, but it also has the most stipulations on when you can use it. So let's get into that. So you can only solve using square roots when there's no x term. Okay, so notice we have an x squared term and we have a constant term, but there's no x term in the middle. So if you have that, no x, then you may solve using square roots. The first step is to get the x squared by itself. And that can look one of two ways, and I'll show you that in the examples. But mostly that is going to look something like x squared equals a number. So we've switched our constant from c to d here because you might have had to divide by an a. Okay. Once you have x squared by itself, then you are going to square root both sides. So if you remember, the square root of x squared just becomes x because the square root and the square essentially cancel each other. So there's 3 options for what you can get. The first option, if your constant is positive, then you're going to have 2 real solutions. So something that we haven't talked a whole lot about, let's say, like what's the square root of 25? Well, it's really plus or minus 5 because 5 squared is 25 and negative 5 squared is 25. Okay, so what's the square root of 36? It's really plus or minus 6, and that gets you both of those solutions. So when you have something like this first one up here, let's do x squared equals 16, right? So I have my x squared by itself. I'm going to square root both sides. You are going to need to put the plus or minus in there. So my answers are plus or minus 4. There's 2 answers. If you were to graph this equation, if I graphed x squared minus 16 equals 0, remember I want it equal to 0 when I graph it, that would actually cross the x-axis twice. Okay, so that's where my 2 solutions come in, is that I need to put a plus or minus. So the second case is what if you have it equal to 0? All right, so you're still going to square root both sides. So let's say I have x squared equals 0. Well, when I square root both sides, is there a plus or minus 0? Do I need to say x equals plus or minus 0? No, because they're the same number. So in that case, you have one solution, and that one solution is just 0. Okay. The third case we want to look at is what happens when your constant is a negative number, a number less than 0. So that would be something like x squared equals negative 4. So if I square rooted both sides, so I get x, what's the square root of negative 4? If you do that in your calculator, it's going to give you an error. Okay, there's the whole point of a square root is something times itself that makes that number. Nothing times itself will ever make a negative number. Anything times itself will make a positive number. So we're going to say no real solution. It does have a solution, but it's imaginary. This is the same thing as graphing and having your parabola not cross the x-axis. So let's turn to our extra practice and get started. Okay, so there's really kind of 2 steps. Step number 1, get x squared by itself. So on number 1 here, I'm going to subtract 49 from both sides. X squared equals a negative 49. That's step 1. Step 2, I'm going to square root both sides. Okay, so I'm square rooting a negative. Can I do that? Can't do that. So we just say no real solution and we're done. Okay, so there's an example of a no real solution. So let's look at number 2. Okay, first step, get x squared by itself. So how do I get x squared by itself? I'm going to add 25 to both sides. So if x squared equals 25, notice there's no x term, just an x squared term. Up next, I'm I'm going to square root both sides. Okay, there are essentially 2 square roots to 25, and you have to have them both. So 5 squared is 25, and negative 5 squared is 25. So whenever you are square rooting a positive number, when you're solving, you need to put in that plus or minus. All right, let's do the third one real quick. So I got to get x squared by itself. So I'm going to subtract the 6. That gives me x squared equals 0. Then I'm going to come in and square root both sides. And the square root of 0 is 0. And I don't need to put the plus or minus because there's not necessarily a negative 0. So those are the 3 situations we're going to look at. Okay, so we're going to move on and do a couple down this page. So you'll notice all of these have a leading coefficient, something in front of the x. So we're going to tackle them the same way. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to get x squared by itself. So I'm going to start with number 5. So to get x squared by itself, the first thing I'm going to do is add 72 to both sides. You don't want to do anything with that 2 to begin with. All right, so I added 72 to both sides. X squared is still not by itself. It has that 2. To get rid of that 2, you're dividing it because it's 2 times x squared. So then x squared equals 36. Once you have x squared by itself, square root both sides, and then you just got to remember if it's a positive, you're going to have to do a plus or minus because both of those things squared will make 36. Okay, I want to look at number 6 next. I'm going to leave number 4 for you to do. So number 6, what's the first thing you're going to do? We're going to add 12 to both sides. That's going to give us a negative x squared equals 0. Okay, but I wanted to do this one to point out, so that negative x squared, you still need to get rid of that negative. To get rid of that negative, you're going to divide both sides by -1, or you can multiply both sides by -1. So basically, you're just doing that because the negatives will cancel, and 0 divided by anything is still 0. And when you square root both sides, that gives you x equals 0. So if you want to go ahead and pause, you can do number 4. I'll write it up for you real quick. So number 4 is no real solution because in the end you should have been square rooting a negative number, and that does not work. All right, we'll continue on here. So these are really looking at the same thing. Just remember the very first thing you're going to do is you're going to get x squared by itself. So looking at number 10, I'm going to add the 1 over. So I got 16x squared equals 1. Okay, then I'm going to divide by this 16 to finish getting x squared by itself. So I have x squared equals 1/16. Then I'm going to square root both sides. Okay, so x equals, when you're square rooting a positive, you're going to put a plus or minus. And then this is why we went through all of those radical properties, is because this is the square root of 1 over the square root of 16. The square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 1/16 is 1/4. Okay. If you want to go ahead and work these out, you're welcome to. I believe for number 11, you're going to get no real solution because you're going to be square rooting negative. And then for number 12, I'm pretty sure you're going to get x equals 0 because you're going to be square rooting 0. But work those out and make sure that I'm correct there. All right, so up next we're going to start with 13. You'll notice these look totally different, okay? Typically, if you were to see something like x minus 4 squared, you might have the notion to go ahead and write it out twice and then to FOIL it. So I got first, outer, inner, and last. And that would actually make x squared minus 8x plus 16. That is harder to work with. Notice you now have an x term. X terms, like, they mean more work for you. You really don't want an x term, okay? So you are not going to FOIL these out. Do not FOIL these out. This is something squared equals a constant. And that's exactly what you want. So what you can do from the beginning on these is you just square root both sides. The square root and the square are going to cancel each other. You're going to get x minus 4, square root of 0 is 0. You're going to add 4. X equals 4, and it's done. you will have more work if you work them out, if you work out that square. Don't do that. So number 14, what are you going to do? You're going to square root both sides. So we're going to have x plus 2, because those cancel. Okay. Now, I'm square rooting a positive, so I'm going to do a plus or minus, and the square root of 196 is 14. Okay, so then I'm going to subtract the 2 over. Now, write it like this for me, just go with it, is you're going to write it -2 plus or minus 14. Putting that plus or minus last helps you to conceptualize it a little more. So then you need to actually, you're going to go one step further. You're going to go -2 plus 14, and you're going to go -2 minus 14. So what's -2 plus 14? It's 12. And -2 minus 14 is -16. And there's your two answers. Notice there's not a plus or minus in your answer. That's okay. Okay, but you went through that math, and those are your two answers. So let's go ahead and look at number 15 while we're here. You're going to start by square rooting both sides. That's going to give you 2x plus 7. Now I'm square rooting a positive, so you're going to do plus or minus 7, because that's the square root of 49. Okay, so then you're going to subtract the 7, and I really want you to leave this as -7 plus or minus 7. You're going to put your plus or minus thing at the end. Just going to leave it like that for the moment. Okay, we've got one more step here. We're going to divide by 2 because our x is not by itself yet. So x equals -7 plus or minus 7 over 2. Then you're going to look at doing this math. You're going to do -7 plus 7. So that's 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. And then you're going to do -7 minus 7. That's -14. Divided by 2 is -7. And there's your two answers. Okay, we have one more slide to look at. So what you might notice is different about these is there's a leading coefficient in front of the parentheses. You may not distribute it. Do not distribute it. Can't do it. Okay, you can't do it because you have a square and exponents come before multiplication in your order of operations. So do not ever distribute into parentheses that are also squared. Okay. You could potentially take the square root of both sides to begin with because this happens to be a nice squared number outside, but I'm going to suggest you actually want to get rid of the 16. To get rid of the 16, you're going to divide by 16 because it's 16 times, like there's a times in there. So the 16s will cancel. You're going to get x minus 3 squared, and because 25/16 doesn't reduce, you're just going to leave it 25/16. Okay, up next, now you're going to square root both sides. Square root and the square cancel, so you get x minus 3. Remember, you're always going to put a plus or minus if you are square rooting a positive number. And the square root of 25/16 is actually 5/4, because you're going to square at the top and square at the bottom. Up next, you're going to add 3 to both sides. So you're going to have x equals 3 plus or minus 5/4. 5/4 is 1 1/4. So then you're going to do 3 plus 5/4. So that should be 4 1/4. And you can just write it as 4 1/4. And then 3 minus 5/4. So 3 minus 1 is 2, minus another 1/4 should get you to 1 3/4. And you can write them like that. Or you may write them as improper, as 17/4 and 7/4. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing on number 17. Okay, you have to get rid of that 81. You cannot distribute it, so you're going to divide by it. 49 over 81 does not simplify, so you're just going to leave it as 49 over 81. Since your squared thing is by itself, you're going to square root both sides, which gives you 3x plus 1 equals plus or minus, because you're square rooting a positive number, 7/9, because that's the square root of 49 over the square root of 81. Okay, we got a couple of steps here. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to subtract the 1. You're going to put the 1 in the front, because that you want your plus or minus thing at the back. And then you're going to divide by 3. You're going to divide everything by 3. So at the moment, that looks like -1 plus or minus 7/9 over 3. Okay, so then if we break that apart, -1 plus 7/9 should be -2/9 divided by 3. Remember, dividing by a fraction is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So, and to multiply goes straight across. So that should be -2/27. And then -1 minus 7/9 is -1 and 7/9, which should be -16/9 divided by 3, which is times a third, which would be -16 over 27. Okay, I'll leave 18 for you if you have room to do it. So that's what I have for you today. Please let me know if you have any questions, or attend one of our live sessions if you have questions.